fixed number of new acronyms I can learn about networking every day before I throw my hands up in the air every time I try and understand it all.
Being a parent definitely changes how you operate as a leader.
Best book on management I've ever read, 48-hour potty training method.
Get to it fast. Right here on the Anycast. Make it strong, make it last. Right here on the Anycast.
All right, I am here today with, I think, the only person I consider a friend who at one point in their life has lived on a boat. I don't know what it is with me and boat people, but we generally don't get along. But Kris is the exception.
For now.
For now. Yeah, it's early. Kris is. I don't want to give you my version of your intro. So I have some perceptions about who you are and where you came from. But tell the world, who's Kris? How'd you get here?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So, hi, I'm Kris Beevers. I am a boat person, for what it's worth. Let's start there. I have lived on a boat in Singapore, and I still have a boat. I don't live on it anymore. But I'm a tech person, startup person. Started a few companies. Probably the one most people will have some familiarity with is this one right here, NS1. Managed DNS traffic steering company that we started more than 10 years ago now in New York, and grew and sold last year to IBM. So there's that, right? The other one, Superman style, is there. It is, NetBox Labs, right? Which is what I'm focused on right now. Very different business, around NetBox, which a lot of folks I think are going to know, right? Open source network management, network automation tech, where I'm also founder CEO. And I've been doing, I guess I would say, internet-y stuff for quite a while. First startup for me was 25 years ago, doing file sharing, when you could get away with that kind of thing. And as a result of that, fell in love with internet applications, internet infrastructure, scaling these things. And that's kind of been the theme for me ever since. Couple other little tidbits about me. You already mentioned the boat thing. That's a big one for me. I live in New Jersey, got a little family, a little 6-year-old who's in kindergarten right now. Grew up in upstate New York. I have a PhD in robotics. Not a lot of people know that. So very different world than the internet, but that robotics thing, if the internet thing ever doesn't work out, I'll go back to that, right? Because it turns out that's an interesting industry now too. So that's me in a nutshell.
Yeah, awesome. And give us I always tell people, I'm like, give us 3 minutes on NetBox so everybody knows to fast forward 3 minutes through any marketing promotional material.
Well, I'm not a very marketing promotionally guy, but NetBox. First of all, it's open source software, right? Like, you can just go download it. You can use it. That's what most people do, right? And it is used by networking teams as what we call the network source of truth, right? It is the system record for the resources and the configuration of the network, and it captures, as you would call it, like the intended state of the network. That turns out to be really important, especially as networks get complicated. You got to write it all down somewhere, right? So the very first use case that most people start with on NetBox is network documentation, right? They've got all these Excel spreadsheets and wikis and YAML files, and at some point that stuff breaks, and you've got to get it into a model that the team can work with cohesively. That's the starting point for NetBox. But once you have that model, once you have your network written down, call it the intended state of the network written down in NetBox, pretty quickly, it starts to become the linchpin for automation, right? So people drive network automation around NetBox, and that's, I think, really created a ton of lift. The reason I said earlier, I think a lot of people are going to be familiar with NetBox already, is it's not a shiny new technology, right? NetBox has been around since probably 2016 or so. I think it was open source by Jeremy Stretch, who's the project founder, and one of the reasons that we're building this business, NetBox Labs, around NetBox is it is everywhere, right? Everyone uses NetBox as it is today, right? So it's pretty pervasive tech in networking. And it's been really fun now to start to figure out how do we build a sustainable model around it to continue to invest and scale and so on. That's what we're doing at NetBox Labs.
Perfect. Do you think, is there something unique about network? Like I'm sort of going back through all the stuff that we've ever built. Is there something unique about network that always puts people in a place where it's like, oh my God, we've got this over here and this over here and this over here? Like, is it about networking? Is it about the people who tend to be network engineers? Because it seems like everybody always starts with chaos, and I don't know that that's necessarily true in other areas.
Yeah, I don't think it's something that's unique to networking. I think it is a function of the fact that the network is foundational, and networking in almost every business has existed pretty much forever, right? Like as a component of the infrastructure of the enterprise, and has evolved organically over time. And there's so many dimensions to that evolution, right? There's the evolution, or there's the progression of the business within which the network sits. There's the progression of networking technology. There's the progression of, how we are interacting with systems on the network, and the applications that are sitting on the network. And so there's so many ways in which like the needs, the pressures, the demands on the network and the networking team evolve. That I think it's pretty natural over that duration, and across all those dimensions, for the technology and the management infrastructure and everything else to evolve really organically. And organic evolution is how you end up with a disjointed, spaghetti mess, which is frankly what we see in most infrastructures, right?
I don't know anything about that.
Nothing at all, right? Like, yeah. but contrast it to, think 10 or 15 years ago, back when, the the long lost art of system administration existed, right? And what was the life of a systems administrator? It's the same thing, right? Like our servers and our applications and so on were also a spaghetti mess, and at some point, that mess needed to get organized because of the pace of change and the demands on the business, right? So I think that's kind of the mode we're in networking at the moment.
Yeah. And do you think, people moving to cloud need it more or less than kind of that traditional networking stack? Like I try and wrap my head around all the cloud networking stuff, and I just give up after like, there's only a fixed number of new acronyms I can learn about networking every day. And I don't know.
Yeah, there's limited brain space for.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a few thoughts here, right? So cloud networking is different, first of all. What exists on the cloud networking side, especially if you're concentrating your investment in, one particular cloud, like AWS or Microsoft or whatever, is like a cohesive set of concepts and management tooling and integration across those concepts and so on. What we really see happening, especially with teams who are bringing cloud networking into their stack, as opposed to starting clean and fresh in the cloud, which doesn't happen. If you exist, you don't get to start clean and fresh in the cloud. If you're springing into existence, you might get to, right? Is the concepts of cloud networking and the outcomes and benefits of cloud networking, especially around like the expectations of the teams that you support in terms of self-serviceability and velocity and so on. Those things back propagate to the enterprise network or to the corporate network or whatever you want to call it. And when I talk with IT operations or a networking team in some big Fortune 500 enterprise, almost invariably one of the things that I hear is, this shift of some of our organization's capacity to the cloud is driving expectations on our network that are causing us to need to operationalize more effectively, enable self-serviceability, enable automation, move at faster velocity, and sort of normalize around this new set of expectations driven by what's happening on the cloud networking side.
Yeah.
What it isn't, like there's zero case ever, I think, from my vantage point today, that all networking is lifting to the cloud, right? Like that is not going to happen, right? So what we see is like a renormalization of what networking means and the expectations of the business with respect to the network, driven by that cloud.
Yeah, it's interesting because like I kind of, before I throw my hands up in the air every time I try and understand it all, while I'm somewhere between, hey, I'm going to try and learn about this today, and I give up. Like the thing that's constant is the most primitive thing becomes logical, not physical in cloud land, right? So like you're never starting with a device. And I think that's what breaks my brain. And then on the flip side, though, inside those existing networks, if people want, if people want to end up with that same concept, it's a lot of work. Like, somebody threw up in one of our meetings, I don't know, 3-4 months ago, just talking about server infrastructure, they're like, cattle, not pets. And I'm like, do you know how much money it costs to make it cattle? Like, you understand there's 150,000 engineers at AWS making it so you can have cattle. Like, it's... Well,
this is that's, you hit the nail on the head, right? Like the reason AWS can give you the cattle, not pets experience is purely scale, right? And almost no enterprise, even the biggest, who are not cloud providers, can't deliver that experience because the scale isn't there, right? And so, I think the best organizations, what we see is they provide some semblance of that experience to their users, right? Like, hey, I need a new IP, give it to me, right? Fine. But that isn't the experience of the networking or the IT operations of the data center team. Right. They're the ones who are shuttling around behind the scenes, like, oh my God, we need to rack another device. Right?
It's like someone's this world where you think nothing ever physically breaks at AWS or physically needs to be touched at AWS. I'm like, what? Like, no, there's a lot of physical stuff going on. It's abstracted from you.
That's exactly right. Like there's an abstraction layer that you never have to think about. That is enabled by their scale. And so that's what, like, everyone's trying to emulate that to a degree. It's not going to make, like, the same experience in a corporate network is not going to make sense, realistically. Right now, the counterpoint that I'll just go ahead and make is, I do think there are some systems or services of the traditional network that are gonna lift and shift more often, and we see it happening in like the I don't know. I'll pull out like these SASE or SSE or Zero Trust or whatever realms. Like, it does make sense to like thin down the footprint in your branch office to like the switch and the circuit, right? Because I can then consume all those cloud services. I don't need to rack a firewall, right? I think we're going to see more of that happen because it enables that like scaled, abstracted experience for certain use cases. But like still, Zscaler or whoever, right, has humans shuttling around behind the scenes racking firewalls, right? Somebody's got to be doing it. It moves the problem.
Well, I want to dive into that, distinction of the enterprise, because that's a world that you have a ton of experience in, and probably more by the day. And I don't. Like, my mental model for what a company on the internet is somebody pushing bits, whether that's small or web scale. It's still like that's your business, right? You're not an insurance company. You might host a SaaS portal for insurance companies, but it's. So, one of the things I always had a hard time with cloud was around the economics of it. And the idea of just like, how? Why? Like, this can't make sense. And then so, I entertain the idea that like, But what if I had small branch offices, and in them I paid MSRP for Dell servers, and then I also paid MSRP for Cisco switches, and then I paid them for support, and then I paid a team to, fly around to branch offices, and then I was like, oh, I guess for those people, the cloud actually does save a lot of money.
And you've just described your general enterprise, right? Like, this is it's a really interesting theme. I mentioned this in kind of sharing a brief lens into my backstory, but obviously, like most of my life has been on in the world that you described, right? Like NS1, we pushed a lot of bits, and like our reason for being was internet companies, pretty much, right? Like SaaS companies, content companies, people pushing bits. Like we were making it, and NS1 continues to make it more effective for companies to push a lot of bits to the internet. That was sort of the reason for being. Yeah, a noble cause, right? And like right as that business was getting to the stage where we were needing to figure out what is this enterprise thing to continue to grow at the pace that we wanted to. That's when it made sense for IBM, in our case, to swoop in and say, well, we know all about that. Like, why don't you get on our ship? And so, NS1 is now growing in the enterprise, and I don't have a great lens into that. But NetBox is very enterprise, right? And don't get me wrong, like some of the biggest, like, IaaS companies and SaaS companies and so on are using NetBox, but the use cases generalize to especially networks that have lots of branch offices or campus networks, or think about like retail or hospitality type networks where there's thousands of branches out there in the wild, and then there's like a poor little 5-person networking team whose job is manage all those footprints and, sort of spin 5 up every week, right? 5 new coffee shops every week, or 5 new fast food chain restaurants every week, and spin down these ones. And the use cases are just wildly different, right? It's about enabling the model of whatever the business is, enabling, the engagement of all the humans who make up the business, enabling the applications that sit within the business that maybe, like when we talk about applications, like when you and I talk about applications, we think web apps or SaaS applications or whatever. Yeah, this thing that we're going to build. Yeah. But one of the things I'm learning is every business, like a bank, has thousands of applications that none of us ever see, right? But that make up like the cogs in the machine of how, like, we swipe a credit card or whatever, right? And every one of those is connected via network, and the network is hyper critical to the operations of an organization like that. And yet, at least from my vantage point, hasn't received quite the same level of attention and investment that internet applications have. And I think that's been really illuminating for me as we've just in the last year kind of really gone down this NetBox journey and understood the needs of the enterprise.
Yeah, so I'd like to talk about that, because you jumped off the ship that IBM is now steering, and talk a little bit about the difference between, something you and I were talking about before we started, is the difference between, I'll borrow Peter Thiel's paradigm of the difference between building something that's 0 to 1, which was kind of most startup experiences, and certainly was NS1. But NetBox is a little bit more of a 1 to N exercise. How is that different?
Yeah. Well, let's contextualize your point a little bit, and then let's talk about how it's different, right? So you're right. Like NS1, when you and I first met, we were talking about this earlier. We probably had 3 customers in the business, and it was pure IaaS, right? Like there's no software that anyone was using or anything like that. Like we built some tech, we put it on the internet, made a sign up form, right, or a call us or whatever form, and started to hunt down customers, right? And over time, we were able to grow a really big and really important customer base, but we started with none, right? Started with nobody using the thing, and we really had to figure out like how to talk about and engage, potential customers around. Here's the problem that we've built this technology to solve, and here's how we're better and different than Dyn or Newstar or Akamai or whomever, right? And why you should try our shiny new thing. And in contrast, NetBox is very different, because it's open source, right? NetBox a little bit more on like the provenance here. NetBox was built by the networking team at DigitalOcean back in the mid 2010s when they needed to solve these problems of documenting and automating their obviously like big, complex, rapidly evolving IT and network environment. And because this tech is obviously not core to their business model, which is developer cloud, they said, you know what, let's open source it. And it took on a life of its own. I think the reason it took on a life of its own, in part, was there was a community around Jeremy Stretch, who's the founder of this open source project already. He's the guy, some people may recall the old Packet Life blog. That was Jeremy. All these tutorials and engagement around his content. And so that was like a shot in the arm initially for engagement around this interesting new NetBox tool. And it caused people to try it, cause people to contribute to it, cause people to say, oh, this is a better way than Excel for managing my IP addresses, for example, or whatever. Begin to use it, and sort of grew and evolved organically from there, as we've seen a lot of other open source projects do. And so the state of play today is NetBox is used by everyone, right? Like almost every enterprise in the world with a network has NetBox in it somewhere, is what I continue to find. And yet, no business was built around this thing. It was really organic, real like community-led adoption and contribution and so on to this project. And that works to a point. And at some point, and this is what we found at NS1, at some point, maybe the founders and the lead maintainers of the open source project, start to get tired, or the demands of the project go beyond what they can manage on a day-to-day basis, and it gets really challenging to manage this thing totally organically. At some point, you've got to figure out how to make it sustainable, because it's an important technology to the world, and that is definitely what NetBox is. Mm-hmm. And we can talk about this a little bit more, but that's our mission at NetBox Labs, is like, let's figure out how to make this really important open source project and community self-sustaining, how to like hire and pay for developers and engineers and product managers and so on around this thing, how to help companies be more successful with this software. And it's very different than, as you said, than the outset of something like NS1, where no one's using this thing. Everybody's using this thing. And so, in a lot of ways, it feels like we're way bigger, right at the outset of NetBox Labs than NS1 ever was, right? There's a far larger install base, but there are other ways in which we're way smaller. Like there's so much demand and so much, I guess I would say like chaos, because of the scale and the needs of the existing install base. And we started a year ago spinning out from NS1 with, a few people, no office, like any seed stage startup, basically saying, oh, we gotta figure out how to meet this demand. So I think it's been very important at the outset of this business that we had the scale experience from NS1, running some gigantic chunk of the internet through our DNS, in order to address the scale of the open source install base and community, and figure out how to orient a business in support of it. If we didn't have that, right? If we were, shiny new entrepreneurs cutting our teeth for the first time on this NetBox problem, I think we would be drowning. There's a little bit of perspective and probably a lot of different threads that we could pull in there.
Yeah, something that strikes me is, something that I always find interesting is, when people start businesses and they say, we're going to build in public, right? We're going to make all of our, everything's going to be transparent, share all the details. It strikes me that this is a very different but probably more challenging version of building in public, because there's a lot of day zero opinions on what you need to be doing in your business that aren't coming from founders, investors. Just having that built-in user base with a set of expectations has to be a real challenge.
There are a lot of stakeholders, to use that word, right? You're right, like many and varied opinions. And you see this in any open source business, right? Like one of the things that we know is as we build commercial offerings around NetBox, for example, 90% of the people using NetBox are never going to engage commercially, right? They're going to continue to use the open source, and they're going to have expectations and demands on the open source project, and that's fine for what it's worth, right? Like one of the terms that I use to describe the nature of what we're trying to build is this notion of a virtuous circle, right? Our job is figure out how to build commercial products that you pay for around NetBox that are valuable to that 10% who wants to engage commercially, generate revenue that enables us to go hire open source developers, open source product managers, and the like, who are going to create more value, in the open, to your point, for the 90%. And some people hate that, right? There are purists who say, like, revenue around this open source project is bad, right? Like there should never be that. I think my personal opinion is, we want the open source community and project around NetBox to succeed. We want it to continue to exist. We want it to get better. We want it to adapt to the new needs in the world as new technologies emerge or new use cases emerge or whatever. And the only way that happens is some kind of investment. And that investment so far has been borne mostly on a volunteer basis, by people who have poured their heart and soul into the open source technology and project. But for that to continue to persist, not just for a few more years, but, on an ongoing basis, decades, right? Like you've got to figure out how to make it sustainable. And I think that takes dollars, right? I think if you look at the best open source businesses in the world who have had a similar problem of, a scaled open source install base and then trying to figure out how to make it sustainable, it's businesses like Mongo, for example, or Grafana or HashiCorp or others, right? Like they've really figured out this virtuous circle. And it's a win for everybody type situation, right? The people who really have no interest in ever engaging commercially or don't need the features or capabilities of some cloud product or enterprise product, they don't have to, right? They can continue to get value out of the open source. And through this virtuous circle, like that's going to continue to evolve and get better and sustain and so on. But the flip side of it is, I mentioned, the biggest enterprises in the world are using NetBox. At some point, they all say, boy, we really wish we had a throat to choke. We really wish we could call somebody and say, hey, this bug is really important to us. Somebody please fix it. And if they don't have the open source development expertise, historically, they couldn't do it. There was no hope for them. And then you also run into something that's an emerging and interesting lens for us is there are organizations who simply can't adopt technology like NetBox without having, commercial engagement, like government agencies is an interesting example, right? Like they require, for compliance and regulatory reasons, the ability to engage with an organization who can support something like a NetBox. And So all of these are ways that a technology like NetBox can gain adoption, but also, have that sort of circle of reinvestment in the open source that makes it sustainable. And like to be clear, I don't think we figured it all out yet. But one of the things that we're lucky to be doing is building a business around NetBox at a time when there are these great examples in the world like Mongo and Grafana and Hashi and so on, to learn from about how to do it well.
One of my questions was going to be: is there a model that you go, oh wow, that is super? If we could accomplish those same things, we'd be happy.
Well, let's talk about it a little bit more, actually. So, because there is no one right model for doing this kind of thing, and one thing that I'm learning at the outset of NetBox Labs, we're about a year old as a standalone business after spinning out from NS1. And, for context, for those who don't know our company very well, I use those names, HashiCorp and Mongo and Grafana, because our investors and our board members are all the people who were the lead investors and the board members in those businesses, right? Like we did that on purpose. We really wanted to learn the lessons from these companies who've done this well and come before. And so we constructed a team, an investor set and a board and a team that has that experience on how to do this well. But networking is a little different. All of those are developer and DevOps type businesses, right? One simple way to think about this: the people who download and use open source software for databases, or download and use open source software for observability or for DevOps or whatever it is, like they're really good at downloading and using open source software. Like that's kind of their job. They're site reliability engineers or they're developers or whatever. People who download and use NetBox generally, don't have a background of, operating open source software in a scalable, secure, sustainable way. They're doing it because it solves a really, really important problem, but they're almost doing it in spite of the fact that it's, open source software that's accessible to them and they can download and run. And so, one of our learnings is the business model is a little different as a result. Like most open source businesses, start by offering support or an enterprise version of the open source software. We started by offering NetBox Cloud, which is exactly what it sounds like, right? It's a cloud offering, and the reason that makes sense, and the reason that's worked, is network engineers mostly just want to use the tech, right? Like they want to solve their problems of operating the network, scaling the network, architecting the network, automating the network. That's what they're great at, right? And running NetBox and scaling NetBox and securing NetBox and upgrading NetBox and that kind of thing, like that's not quite their skill set, nor do they want it to be. And that's not the highest and best use of a network engineer's time, right? So we're learning like our business model is a little different than the business models that have come before in open source because we're serving network engineers, and their needs are a little bit different.
Do you think that changes? That's very insightful. Do you think that changes, like one of the things that's, I have actually a two-part question. Number one, in general, so historically, do you feel like you've been good at hiring? And if so, why? And then the second question is, in a open source world, I think what you said is pretty related to that, because I was going to say, it must be so much easier to be hiring in a world where you're building an open source product. But then I think of it, the contributors really aren't the users, which is also probably different than those other companies you mentioned. So it's not quite as straightforward as I would have thought.
Yeah, it isn't as straightforward as I thought, right? Actually, it's a very insightful question. I'm going to work backward a little bit, right? Like one of the hypotheses we had, back at NS1 as we were starting to incubate a business around NetBox, was, well, this is open source. There's all these people in the community. It's going to provide leverage to hiring awesome developers who already know NetBox and are already contributing to it. And to be clear, that is the case. Just not quite in the same way I would have expected, right? Like, in fact, just yesterday or the day before, I went into our NetBox community Slack channel and I said, "Hey, we're hiring again, right? Like, we really love hiring from our community. Here are a couple of the open roles." But what we've learned is, the community provides some leverage to hiring software developers and engineers. There are people who've contributed to NetBox who really would love to do that on a full-time basis, and so we've made those kinds of hires. But more frequently, the kind of expertise that the open source community helps us access and hire are network engineers who really know NetBox, know how to use NetBox, want to help other people use NetBox, right? And so, roles like solutions engineers or architects, or roles like customer success and customer support engineers, like, interestingly, there's a ton of incredible talent in the NetBox community to that end. Now I want to back up to your other question. Like, have we, in general, in the past, whether it's at NS1 or NetBox Labs, if we've done a good job of hiring, and like we have, right? What I've learned is hiring great people, at least in a technology company, I think, most often comes down to impact, right? Like, especially engineers, what do they want? Like, they want to work on cool tech for sure, right? But they really want to see that the tech that they're working on has an impact on the world somehow. And we have built an incredible team at NetBox Labs. We had, and NS1 continues to have, an incredible team of technologists. And the reason is that we've painted a picture for the future of the world and the vision that we're pursuing, whether with NetBox, it's, this virtuous circle of investment in this really impactful open source project and a future for how networks are going to be built and operated and automated, or whether at NS1 it was, we're the front door to 25% of the internet or something like that. We've painted a picture for talent for why, if they come and work with us, they're going to have a big impact on the world. And to give you a few examples, just at NetBox Labs, we have an incredible engineering team. And, I think when I think about some of the folks in our engineering team, why are they working at, this, relatively early stage startup, when, some of them are coming from working for some of the largest infrastructures and networks in the world, building automation tech and building source of truth technology and the like, getting paid 10 times more than they can at NetBox Labs. It's the impact. That's why, right? Like, they really value creating technology for their peers that is used by such a large community and has such a big impact on how networks are being operated and automated and so on. So, that to me is sort of the secret.
So I'm going to change gears. In my mind, it's not changing gears, but it sounds a little bit like changing gears. How has being a parent changed you as a leader?
I know you have been through a similar journey a couple of times, right? And I mentioned this earlier, but for everyone's context, I have one 6-year-old, and he was born, I guess about halfway through our NS1 journey, and he started kindergarten this year and was gearing up for that just as we were going through this acquisition of NS1 and spin out of NetBox Labs and so on. And there's no question, first of all, that your question is valid, right? Like, being a parent definitely changes how you operate as a leader or just as a professional, I think. And there's some stuff in here that I suppose seems sort of obvious, but is worth stating. Like, being a parent focuses you, right? Like, I have a priority at 2:30 today, because it's a Friday as we're recording this. I am going to go pick my kid up from kindergarten, right? Like, doesn't matter what's going on at NetBox Labs. He's got to get picked up, and he's going to need a snack, and he needs to play with his friends, right? Like there's no question about that. And so, even just on a calendar basis, right? Like my calendar is contained and dictated and guided by the needs of the family, the needs of being a parent, right? And then if you further that, right, it drives your prioritization. Like I no longer can count on working 18-hour days if the business demands it, right? Like I really have to get deliberate about what are the most important things to accomplish in the business today for me to enable our team with respect to meet the needs of customers and so on. It's such a focusing state of being, I guess I would say. The other lens that may be a little less obvious is, especially as your kids get to this age of 6 or 7 or 8 or whatever it is, I feel a real responsibility to be a role model. And you want to show your kids, you want to show them a lot of things. You want to show them balance, but you also want to show them what it means to be professional, to bring passion to what you're doing, to be, what's the right word, to be upstanding, I guess I would say, like to do what you say you're going to do, meet your commitments, all of those kinds of things. And I actually love it. We live our lives these days on Zoom a lot, right? And I actually love it when my son, wanders in behind me and starts to participate in a call. And like I have done customer calls, with my son. I've done team calls, all kinds of calls that he will in some little way, participate in. And I think that's great. I guess I would say like the role model aspect, I've learned is, at least for me, really important. And that it's yet another form of accountability, self-accountability, I guess I would say. And, and how I operate on a day-to-day basis. So like there's a million ways it changes everything, I guess, as you know well.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you feel it gives you a different perspective on the growth curve of your people and your team? Because that's something I found is I all of a sudden found a lot more patience for people struggling to learn something, let's say, or struggling in a role that I probably didn't have before I watched, my first child struggle with learning something new or whatever. And because with kids, the payoff, right? It's like, I don't want to say I'm pessimistic, but I have a hard time at work being like, oh my God, amazing. Now you're able to do your job. Like, wow, what a real reward for like you struggled, you learned, now you're doing the thing you're supposed to be doing. You should feel a sense of pride about that. But I can't go out and buy a cake for that necessarily as the leader. But on the flip side, watching your kid, learn to crawl or walk or whatever, you actually are like, oh my God, you're walking just like every other human with DNA. Yay, oh my God, that's so amazing. Like you can actually see the at least for me, I feel that sense of accomplishment, pride,
Right.
But watching the struggle in a way that I didn't before.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting perspective. For me, it's a little bit different. And there's a few things in there that you said that do really resonate. So, for example, learning the impact of your approval, excitement, pride on your child is really illuminating to the power of, I guess I'd say, like positive reinforcement or recognition, in a professional environment, right? Like this is just me anyway, right? But I've always really believed it's important to recognize accomplishment and recognize, wins in a professional scenario. But watching, in my case, my son's response to my sense of excitement about some accomplishment of his really reinforces how important that is for the people in your team. But like a different lens for a second. And I'm not sure how much being a parent has changed things here for me so much as reinforced is development has got to be a part of your plan for everybody in your team, right? And I think everybody at NetBox Labs and almost everybody at NS1 can attest this. When I'm interviewing someone and considering like, should we bring this person into our organization? One of the most important questions I ask is like, what are your development goals for yourself for the next 3 to 5 years? Because if they're not aligned with our goals as an organization, and if I don't want you to be developing in that way over the next 3 to 5 years, it's not going to work out, right? Like I don't want you to, be seeking to develop these skills or these leadership capabilities or whatever, and we need these things over here. That's going to be disjoint, and you're not going to have your needs, your career path needs met. And the company needs something different from you than where you're at, right? So I think it's really important to be designing roles and hiring people into roles that are aligned with the path they want to be on in general. And like if I'll give you a real example. Recently, we're a Series A company. We're going on 30, 40 people. Which is, not insubstantial, but we're not a 1,000-person organization. And if I'm hiring somebody, as the first, I don't know, technical writer in our organization or something like that right now, and in an interview, they say, well, like my goal for the next year is I want to run a team of 5 people. I'm going to tell them this is not the right role for you. You're not going to have that opportunity here, right? But if they really want to get hands-on and build the function and figure out how they're going to do the thing, that's alignment, right? So really understanding the development goals and the career path of people and how we're going to support that, like all the way back to your question, like observing the importance of stages of development in your child and so on. I think it serves to like reinforce that mentality, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I can't remember who said it was a throwaway line, and somebody was talking about, and they basically said something. Oh, the best book on management I've ever read, the 48-hour potty training method. But it was about that, right? It was about actually human nature and how people want to be seen and grow and rewarded and recognized for their growth. So every once in a while in the back of my brain I'm like, it kind of sounds insulting, but there's probably some truth to it.
I am not going to bring that to my next team meeting, but
yes. Yeah, I have a lot of analogies I've figured out that like I probably shouldn't say out loud to the team. Like, imagine you guys are a kids softball team, and I'm the coach. Is there any? Obviously, you're super. Your passion about NetBox is pretty clear. Are there any other current technologies that really have your synapses firing, or are you just so zoned in on this that you've?
Yeah, I will admit, like one thing about me that is the case is I zone in for sure. What I would say, not technologies per se, and it's going to be on theme with being zoned in on NetBox, but I'm really interested in how open source and like composability of architectures and so on is going to play out in context of networking. I just don't think it's an ecosystem or an industry or realm or whatever you want to call it that has seen the benefits of open source in the same way we've seen on the software development side or call it the DevOps or site reliability or whatever side of the house. And I don't know the answer, but I have an inkling that open source can really like the open source methodology, the notion of an open and composable ecosystem of tools that, are built again in the open by communities, can really accelerate the pace of technology change in networking. And I think that's sort of aligned with our mission, right? Like, of course, we have this mission of creating, like I said earlier, this virtuous circle around NetBox and making the NetBox project sustainable. But I'd say another element of our philosophy, and this is stolen from Grafana, who has done this incredibly well, is what we call this notion of a big tent. And a big tent means openness and composability of the technology in an ecosystem, right? Like we don't believe that NetBox has to be the winner all the time as a source of truth, or we have other technologies in our business for things like network visibility or observability. Do you have to use those with NetBox? No, we want to work just as well with the tools, other open source or closed source network observability tools or network automation tools or operational tools or whatever. And that's a new ethos that I don't think has existed very much in networking. Like you've got these big walled castle vendor ecosystem, the Cisco ecosystem, the Juniper ecosystem, the Nokia ecosystem, and I think open source can really crack that open. So that's not a technology per se. But just for me, the first couple years of experiencing the power of open source in networking through NetBox has really got me fired up about how bringing this ethos more widely and enabling more of an open source ecosystem and community in networking can accelerate the pace of change, accelerate the modernization of the whole stack. And I would say like unlock innovation, as cheesy as that sounds, but I think it's really happening.
Sure. Speaking of vendor ecosystems, given that the clock has started on when HP will run Juniper into the ground, when
no comment.
is this the opportunity? Yeah, no comment. These statements are representative of myself and no other party. Is this the opportunity for maybe a little bit? Like it seems to me like a lot of things are right for a kind of, I don't want to say resurgence, but there's been a lot of kind of open source, open hardware stuff in networking on the periphery. I mean, I remember playing with Cumulus 12 years ago. I don't even know, like a long time ago. And I was like, it just isn't getting the traction. It's kind of close, but like who's really going to leave the, a vendor-based ecosystem? Obviously you have the cloud providers, investing in their own infrastructure stacks. Does an acquisition of this size, and do you think create a vacuum that might get filled by something more open sourcey?
Well, okay. I have a million thoughts on this. So one, let's talk about the acquisition of this size and how that's probably going to play out. And like maybe the headline is slowly, right? Like, I don't think we're going to see is like this big vacuum emerge in the next, as soon as this thing closes. Although, to hearken to another ongoing acquisition exercise where the vacuum is being created very fast. If you look at like what Broadcom is doing to VMware right now, like they're moving really quickly through like a high rate of change at scale that is absolutely, kind of a rug pull on the VMware ecosystem in a bunch of interesting ways. And so it depending on what HP does with Juniper, like I suppose we could see a vacuum being created faster. I just don't expect that to happen, right? I expect it to be a longer, slower play.
Well, and there's like the hardware life cycles are longer than other stuff too, obviously.
There's that, right? And then there's a couple other things that I see happening, right? Like right now I see Nokia emerging as a pretty interesting player, like a bit of resurgence. They're making some really great hires. They're leaning into open source in some interesting realms. SR Linux, Container Lab is a really interesting technology that we interlock and play with a lot and, see as having a big impact. And, whether this bears out or not, right? Like I think what they have perhaps deliberately, perhaps not, sort of started down the path of is being an existing large vendor who opens up, right? Like I think that is a really interesting potential future, whether it's Nokia or somebody else, right? It's an existing vendor with a lot of scale who leans into an open, composable, ecosystem strategy. That could happen. If it doesn't, I do think, not immediately, but probably over the next decade or so, there's probably another window. And, when I think about our goals for NetBox Labs, just to prognosticate a little bit, right? Like, we're not going to stop with NetBox, right? I think we see a huge opportunity in network automation all in. We see a huge opportunity in how networks are managed and the control plane for networking. And, we expect to expand pretty rapidly our product portfolio across that ecosystem that still doesn't touch on, the core networking technologies themselves. We'll see. We'll see. But I think we think big for sure. And I know there are others in the ecosystem that are thinking big. So there are going to be some tests of, whether the ecosystem is ready for another kind of open source or open composable type play in that decade time frame for sure. Where they're going to come from is the interesting question.
Yeah. Sure. And circling back on kind of that expansion idea of taking NetBox Labs to the next level, but even in the current kind of framework, is there something? If there was one thing that you wish those actual enterprise customers understood that you find frustrating, or something that you have to do a lot of educating on?
The short answer is yes. And the medium length answer is there are emerging patterns in how all these organizations ultimately compose like the management and automation architecture for their network. And we are really lucky because of the reach of our open source community and install base to be able to just talk with a lot of people about how is this shaping up for you? How does NetBox fit in? How do your network discovery and assurance tools fit in? Your network observability tools, your network automation tools, how do they all glom together into some sort of architecture to achieve, your management outcomes, your automation outcomes, your reliability outcomes, whatever they are. And because of the volume of visibility we have across like levels of maturity in implementation of these called like modern network management and automation architectures, we're able to extract from that views of like, here's what we think the reference architecture really looks like. And the reality is, like any emerging motion, 15 or 20% of the world, really gets it. And, 80-85% of the world, they want the outcome, but they have yet to really orient to how are we going to get there. So we've been able to, learn from the 15 or 20% of the world that really gets it. Okay, here are the reference architectures. Here's how these technologies really fit together and generate success. And one of our big goals, and one of the things that in our community affords us, and so I have some hope we can actually accomplish, is we want to educate the rest of the world on here is the path that we see, right? Here is what we see the most successful companies in modernizing their network management, modernizing their network operations, modernizing their network automation. Here's what we see them doing over and over and over. And to be clear, that kind of education is not about NetBox. It is about, you generally need some system of record or source of truth. You generally need these kinds of tools for network observability and discovery. You need to connect them together to solve these kinds of problems. You need to tie those into your automation tools in these ways. And when you do those things, these are the outcomes that start to happen, right? And it's really valuable for us because it informs, of course, like our product roadmap and who we partner with and integrate with and everything else that we're doing. But it's also really valuable education for the practitioners in the market, like the best organizations in the world. Like a good example I'll point out is we work with Dartmouth College. Dartmouth College, super mature in their network automation strategy, and they're a great exemplar in what they've built for how other higher ed organizations are trying to build, how other enterprises are trying to build. So it's kind of amplifying that education around what we found as best practices or reference architectures for this stuff. That's what I really wish we could do a little more of.
Yeah. All right. We're going to go to the mailbag now.
All right.
Cue the music.
Do.
Okay. Unsurprisingly, it's going to be a DNS question. Kris, what is your best or favorite "It was the DNS" story?
Oh my goodness. Well, so, I mean, just for context, for the last 10 years of my life, it was always the DNS, right? It was always the DNS. I'm going to, my favorite story, this is an NS1 story and a Dyn story, actually, but like my favorite date in internet infamy is October 21st, 2016, which, some will recognize was the date of the big Dyn DDoS attack that took down, some ridiculous chunk of the internet. And, there's a few things about that date and that scenario that will always stick with me that I think really illustrate the internet generally, right? First thing I'll say is it's not that Dyn, our tooth and nail competitors, had a bad day, right? That was not it, right? In fact, that really sucked. We had bad days too that year, like a lot of DDoS activity that year, and we were down and so on too. My favorite thing about that day was, at NS1, at that stage of our business, we were an early stage startup, and in that one day, we probably roughly tripled the size of I'm not even going to say our customer base, but like the domain footprint and the traffic that we were doing.
Packet per second volume.
Yeah, something like that, like the volume and impact, to put it in those terms, that we were having on the world because so many properties just needed to get back online somehow. And so like the act of triaging those problems and working with customers to get them back online, like our team probably didn't sleep for 2 or 3 days. It was like a true startup moment that I really enjoyed, and I always harken back to when I think of how a startup really needs to behave under some urgent need or duress or something. Another really good example from that day for me was we got phone calls from the Dyn team, and we helped. Right, they were having a really rough day, and they were absolutely our neck and neck competitors, and we were duking it out in every deal and, seeking to outcompete them on product and technology and value prop and commercials and everything else. And yet, that day they were having a really rough day. It was bad for the internet. And the right thing for us to do was offer whatever help or advice or input we could provide. And that to me is that is an internet thing, right? Like that is how network operators and infrastructure operators, really behave. And it, kind of harkens back to those earlier days of, we're all in this together and we're all trying to make this internet thing work. I love in NetBox, I love encountering those kinds of situations where a customer's having a tough time, or even a competitor maybe is having a tough time with something, and we can help. Like the right thing to do in the ecosystem in which we all sit is dive in and help out, figure it out. It'll all shake out in the end somehow. So that was it was the DNS day, and I think a really instructive one.
Yeah. So going back to, you mentioned the good old days of the internet, sort of.
Sort of.
She should have been wearing my I Miss Nostalgia t-shirt. What, like you were an early tech IRC, like old school
1077902. Yeah, that's right. Still remember yeah, that's right. That was ICQ. Sorry. Yeah.
That was ICQ. Yeah, 1708004 for me was ICQ. But we've been around. We both have the pokey gray hairs coming out now, and
they are
a while.
More the kid than the tech.
Is there anything that stands out? Yes. Is there anything that stands out in your mind as something that 25 year ago you would be most impressed by on the internet, either in terms of like what's being done, the technology? Like I'll give you my example is every time I perform a speed test on my phone and I get disappointed that I'm only getting 600 megabits per second down from this little, 25 years ago, my first startup, we had an office with 45 people sharing a 1.5 meg DSL line. And maybe someday we'll be able to afford a T3 for the office. And now it's just like, oh yeah, there's just like an OC 192 that like hangs out in my pocket all the time, and I can fire it up anytime I want. To me, that's the one that like I could not explain to 25-year-old me how much bandwidth you could have over a wireless network anytime.
I mean, I think that's a great one for what it's worth. And I have sort of the same sentiment, but another one for me is just how pervasive it is, right? Like if it is not on the internet, if it's not online, it does not exist in this day and age. And that's sort of like, it's hard to think about when that bit flipped, right? Like it definitely did. Sometime in the 2000s that bit flipped. But, if you think back to, like 25-year-old me or younger, I was always excited when I could, access a resource or interact with a company or something like that online. And now, if it's not online, I don't want to deal with it, right? Like I hate phone calls, right? I hate getting on the phone and having to call somebody. Like, can I not please just fill out a form or click a thing on your website? I think the young generation now is never going to grow up without that, right? But to me, it's really exciting that we got to live through that bit flip, right? Like we understand how incredible this world is. It did not exist this way, 15 years ago, and it's never going to go away after this, right? So that to me is like the pervasiveness is the big one.
Yeah,
Which, by the way, all the way back to something you said right at the outset. Sorry to interrupt. Something you said all the way at the outset, right? The reason I couldn't continue living on a boat, 10 or 12 years ago is I wanted to go sailing, and the internet was not pervasive in the middle of the ocean, 10 or 12 years ago. Now it is, it turns out, right? Like you can buy a thing and have the internet in the middle of the ocean. So maybe again, I could sustain that way.
All right. Well, I can't think of a better note to leave it on than that. So, Kris, thank you for the time. Thank you, obviously, for your expertise and friendship over the years. And I'll see you somewhere on the internet, maybe from a boat, maybe not. But hope
one way or another it'll be online. Yeah. That's right. Well, thank you, Matt, for having me. This is a lot of fun. Really enjoyed the conversation, and see you again soon.
This is different, another round, so much more to talk about. Gonna aim to satisfy with help from CacheFly. Get to it fast. Right here on the Anycast. Make it strong, make it last. Right here on the Anycast. The Anycast podcast, brought to you by CacheFly.